We know his type. He's been around, seen it all, and now wants to give advice to the rest of us. When asked about falling in love, he laughs and says that he's gotten over these things a long time ago. And he's not alone, because increasingly we find that more and more people decide that romantic love, what the Greeks called eros, is not what we should really be looking for in a partner. But even with the best of these sages, one can often feel that there is something missing in their newfound enlightenment, and which calls them out as fakes. And who better to call out a fake than Socrates? Socrates discovers Phaedros, a young friend, outside of the city walls of ancient Athens and in a state of confused delight. Phaedros had been left speechless by a love letter that he had just received from the philosopher Lysias, famous throughout Greece for his wisdom. And this Lysias was now proposing to him, Phaedros, to become his teacher and lover. As a beautiful young man living in 5th century Athens, Phaedros was relentlessly courted by potential suitors, older men who made a living and occasionally a name for themselves by teaching teenage boys the art of public speaking, debating, and winning arguments, often in exchange for money. Now, it has become fashionable to believe that Greeks practice what could be called institutional pedophilia. But the reality is that no one really knows for sure what the relationship between teacher and disciple really involved. To be sure, the two were called erastes, lovers, and the few descriptions that we are left with are filled with homoerotic tones. But with only those fragments to work from, scholars are still divided about the nature of this Greek love. In contrast to actual scholars, however, our popular notion that sex just had to be involved might be saying more about us than about the Greeks. Because if we take a good look at modern pop culture, we'll see that our teenagers, living in a world of free access pornography and OnlyFans, gender dysphoria and sexual education, are far more sexualized than young Phaedros could have ever been back in ancient Athens. And it's not impossible that our conviction about the pedophilic aspect of Greek philosophers is a kind of projection, one that may even reveal a certain guilt concerning what we are doing to our children. But whatever the case might be, it's clear that back in ancient Greece, the two partners, the older teacher and the younger student, were named erastes, lovers, and that whatever they actually got up to, their relationship was both intimate and exclusive. Boys of Phaedros' quality, and much like the beautiful women of today, were definitely the ones doing the choosing, and their older suitors had to convince them about their worth. But Lysias, a celebrity of his time, seems to have hit home with his letter, while Socrates, an outsider who enjoyed a much lesser and more controversial reputation among the Athenians of his days, wants to know exactly what makes this letter so special. And so, in a certain way, Phaedros finds himself trapped between two educators, Lysias and Socrates, and their respective systems of thought. Socrates begins by asking Phaedros to recite the letter, but the young man is playing timid and replies that he cannot remember it perfectly, and it would be a shame to let his memory ruin such a beautiful piece of writing. Socrates, who knows Phaedros all too well, is not convinced and points to the youth's cloak, asking him what is hiding in there. Phaedros is forced to admit that he still has the letter, just as Socrates had predicted, and reluctantly he agrees to his demands. And so, the two of them move to a beautiful spot next to a creek and under a shady willow tree in full bloom. Clearly, this most beautiful of Socratic dialogues is preparing us for a love story to unfold, as Socrates invites young Phaedrus to a sacred place of some nymphs that resounds with the thrill of summer music. And there, the letter is read out loud for Socrates and us reading this dialogue to hear and bear witness. You know what my condition is, and you have heard how I think we should arrange these matters. Lysias then continues, as might have been expected, by suggesting that he, above everyone else, is fit to become Phaedrus' lover. But then, this letter takes a surprising turn. Lysias proclaims that the reason for which he is so suited is that he is not in love with Phaedrus. Lovers, Lysias says, are mad and cannot be trusted with their feelings. They are bound to change, doing more harm than good in the process. Apart from reminding us of some personal frustrations, Lysias' words also reflect the standard view among Greeks, for whom Eros was the bringer of mania, madness, and a lover was often referred to as menomenos, or madly in love. But here we have a problem, and a philosophical one at that. For Lysias' words to be true, he should be able to tell us how love enters the soul, or love's beginnings, if you will. Because if love robs the mind of its logic, like Lysias claims, it follows that once love has entered the soul, there is no hope of resisting it through logic. It's almost like building a house with the strongest walls, but leaving the door open. So Lysias must, under any circumstance, offer a method by which a philosopher can know love's beginning, the archi, the essence, the door, if you will, by which it enters the soul, so as to defend against it. Come on, Phaedrus, read me again to Lysiou logun archi. The beginning of Lysias' speech, Socrates urged his friend. Phaedrus follows through. You know what my condition is, and you have heard how I think we should arrange these matters. Stop, Socrates intervenes. There is something missing, isn't there? The youth does not understand. Read it again, Phaedrus, one more time, from the beginning. Phaedrus is reluctant, and finally, he understands. I believe, Socrates, that what you are looking for is something that is not really there, Phaedrus replies. And he was right, because what Socrates was really looking for in a love letter is what anyone receiving a love letter should be looking for. Love, not in the past tense, as Lysias safely puts it, but in the now of desire. And if Lysias cannot find that, if he cannot find love's beginnings, its first principle, then all his words are in vain, for he can never really control something that he does not even understand or even feel, no more than any of us fools, myself included, can. Unlike Lysias then, Socrates knew what is love's beginning and its madness, which, by the way, as Socrates proceeds to explain, has never really been proven to be an evil, and yet Lysias proceeds as if it had. In contrast, Socrates assures his listener that this is far from certain, as madness can also become the means by which the gods communicate when they want to bestow their gifts to humanity. And so, one can only keep his mind to himself at the cost of closing it to the gods. When the Romantic philosopher von Schelling wrote how there is no greatness without a constant return to madness, he was echoing Socrates, according to whom what Lysias had produced with his speech was a chalki parthenos, a bronze maiden, a statue, beautiful but cold and lifeless. But why take it from these guys? Since too many of us know from experience that the world of the lover is simply different to the one that Lysias describes in his letter. To others around him, the lover's condition might resemble madness, yet to the lover himself, it is exactly the opposite, as in his state of rapture, a lover cannot help but feel that he actually sees the world for what it truly is, perhaps for the first time in his life, and that far from being mad, he has finally come to his senses. Because Eros, love's insanity, is always, and quite strangely if one comes to think about it, infused with a feeling of knowledge. And Socrates, always on the lookout for whatever can teach him, believed that this was no delusion, and that in the moment a lover meets the eyes of his beloved, he is reminded of realities that he once knew before he was born. Lysias then has it all wrong. Insanity is not love's only component, but simply the beginning, followed by something greater, an education that takes place only when love is seen for what it truly is, a glimpse of the gods.